few years ago now, I managed to get my hands on a bit of data from Port Arthur. Many of you might have been already to those ghost tours that they do. And what they allow visitors to do is report or witness what they've witnessed, any reports of ghosts or apparitions or anything paranormal that's happened to them. And so we got just over 1,000 reports. And after whittling it down, some weren't usable. We've got around 800, so still quite a amount. And so what I want to do today is I want to talk a bit about the history of Port Arthur to start us off, give some context for those who might not know. And then I'm going to go into what we've been doing with some of those reports. It's still work in progress, and I'd want us to maybe work together on some of those things. So I'm going to show you some of the reports that we do have, and maybe we can work together. I want to get your input on them and see what you see, because there's lots of ways you can interpret these reports and lots of ways you can analyse them. So hopefully it could be a bit like a talk and a bit of a workshop combined, if you like. So I've never done a talk here before, so I thought it'd be good to start off by just introducing myself. So my background is in psychology. I've done an 8-year degree, got my PhD, did a PhD in test anxiety. I'm mainly focused in education, so I help coordinate a fully online course at Monash. And part of that role was just developing educational materials and managing, day-to-day things, tutors, lecturers, and these sorts of things. I did do some counselling, individual, one-on-one, and clinical group therapies. And this is sort of on the side, something I'm interested in. Why am I interested in this? Well, it wouldn't be obvious from seeing this profile. And so I thought I might just explain some of my background. I belong part of APRA, the Australian Parapsychological Research Association Incorporated, based in Monash. And that's headed up by Vladimir Dubai. And there's our website there if you're interested and want to take a look. So I'm interested in these sorts of things, as many are, based on my own previous experiences. And I thought I might share a few of them with you. I've had probably more than most have, I think. And I'd probably say a dozen or more different experiences. I won't go through each one. I'll maybe go through some of the more interesting ones, if you like. My first experience actually comes from when I was too small to even remember, maybe 3 or 4. And my dad was outside in the garden cutting the grass with a scythe. I think the grass had grown quite long, so that's why he was using that. And I come out to him and I say, I used to use one of those when I was a little girl. And I don't think he thought much of it. And then I carried on. I said, yeah, I used to live in the village of Ilford, which for those who might know in England is now quite a built-up area, but used to be a village, maybe something like this. So I used to live in the village of Ilford, and I died in a fire and all these sorts of things. And at that point, he's called out to my mum and said, this kid's freaking me out, get him out of here. And I was taken away. But that was sort of one of the first experiences that I can report on. Another one, just briefly here, when I was about 12 or 13, these sort of images or figures came out of my cupboard and walked through the wall. It's quite a confusing experience. I didn't know what a ghost was, an apparition. I wasn't scared. I just knew I shouldn't be seeing it. I kept on rubbing my eyes, turning my head back and forward, but they kept on walking through until the last one of them had walked through the wall. I've seen all phenomena. I won't go into that much. But another big thing that happened to me was an out-of-body experience, which I managed to induce once. I read, and some of you might be familiar with his work, Robert Bruce. He's a big player in astral dynamics and out-of-body projections and these sorts of things. And I read a couple of his books. I tried to induce an out-of-body experience myself and found it pretty hard. I think you have to be quite disciplined, and I wasn't disciplined enough. But then one day, after moving house, middle of the day, I was quite tired. It was quite a hot day. I decided to lay down, take a nap. And I woke up sleep paralyzed. For those who haven't experienced sleep paralysis, your mind is awake, but everything else is basically paralyzed. You can't move a muscle. It can be quite a scary experience, but I've experienced it before, and I wasn't scared. and I just wait for my body to wake up. I knew what was happening. Then I thought in my head, well, while I'm in this state, why don't I try some of these out-body techniques? It seems like a perfect time. And so I thought, the first technique that came to mind was, he said, if you're laying there and you're in a trance-like state, you can imagine falling through your bed. And so I did that. Wasn't expecting much. Then all of a sudden, these purple flashes come up in my eyes, and my body, what only I can describe as, felt like it's vibrating very fast. They talk about vibrations. I never understood what that meant until I felt it at that time. And I got excited, and as soon as I got excited, I sort of snapped back into my body, if you like. And I'm like, wow, what was that? You know, that was quite interesting. So I thought, well, look, let's try another technique. So I tried, he said, you know, you can imagine pulling on a rope. So I tried imagining pulling on a rope, same thing. Got excited, came back. And this time I thought it was because maybe it was the technique that wasn't working, but now thinking back on it, I think it's because I was getting excited, and as soon as I got excited, it broke my concentration, if you like, and brought me back. That's my theory anyway. So I tried a third technique, and it's another technique, the last technique that I can remember was, he said, like, imagine seeing yourself from the outside, and so I did that. And this time, because I'm familiar with it now, I wasn't as excited as I was before, and I maintained concentration, and it seemed to gain a momentum. And then, before I knew it, two things happened. I felt like a pressure in my chest, and I heard a breath. It sounded like an external breath. It probably was my breath, but it sounded like it come from the outside. And the next thing I knew, I'm sort of floating above my body, looking down, sort of thing, about 1 or 2 meters above. And it's a really surreal experience, because I'm, as I would say, as conscious as I am now, and you're looking at yourself sort of laying there, if you like, and it's really quite bizarre. And I'm sort of saying, you know, I've done it, I'm out, I'm seeing myself, this actually works, you know. And so I tried a few things. He said, there's a few things you can try to see if it's a genuine experience, not just like a lucid dream or something else. And he said, if you look down at your hands, what should happen is they sort of fade away, a bit like, you know, Back to the Future, if you've seen that. There's a scene where he fades away. It doesn't exactly look like that, or it didn't look like that to me. But I looked down at my hands, and they sort of faded away, as if gradually, you know, from the fingertips down, when I looked at them. And I thought, well, this seems legit. So I tried to move around. I couldn't move around, but yeah. And after about a minute, he also said, if it's your first time, don't spend too long outside, because he said there's a chance you might forget. And so then I sort of went back into my body after that. And sort of came back into my body, sleep paralyzed still, but then after some time that I broke free of the sleep paralysis, and the rest is history. Haven't managed to replicate that, but still a very profound experience for me. And so that's where I'm coming from in terms of all these experiences. That's really what's led me on this journey throughout the years to seeing that there's actually something more than conventional science and what we might know. So maybe I'll go on to talk a bit about Port Arthur and the context of Port Arthur. So it's built in 1830, built as a small timber station originally. In 1833, went on to become a sort of penal colony for sort of Britain's worst convicts and juvenile offenders. In Point Pure, they were also sent to Port Arthur there. What happened there was shipbuilding. Convicts were taught to build ships, shoemaking, timber gathering. There's a coal mine as well, not too far off. And these are sort of trades that they could carry on once they'd been rehabilitated as well outside of Port Arthur too. So not only free labour in that sense. Now, the prison, as you can imagine, had quite a harsh reputation. It's supposedly, obviously it's surrounded by water, supposedly shark infested, whether that's true or not, I'm not sure. But it was quite a hard place to escape from, that's pretty undeniable. And it also gained a harsh reputation because it's quite a unique kind of prison, if you like. So back then, you know, prisons, punishment was like floggings and beatings and things like that. But this took a new take and quite a progressive lens on incarceration, if you like. And that was, with enough reflection, they thought if you give people enough time to reflect, silent time, to reflect on what they've done, they will eventually realise the error of their ways and come around. They also use rewards and punishments, taking things away and giving people things in response to good behaviour, which was quite advanced for the time, since behaviourism wasn't until sort of the early 1900s that started taking off. So this was, the early 1800s. So it was quite a revolutionary thing, I would say. But it didn't work quite well, because what they used to do is, for example, to give people time to reflect on what they've done, they might put a hood on you for a period of time, and that was designed to make you reflect. But all it did was really, well, I suppose it did do that, but at the same time it deprived you of any visual or auditory stimulation, and it sent you quite mad after a time, as you can imagine. And there was an asylum actually nearby that could accommodate for that too, if that did happen. So they did plan it well in that regard. But they also had a place called the separate or the silent prison, and guards used to even walk up and down that with things around their shoes, so it wouldn't even make any noise. And so even when you're in your cell, you're not hearing any sounds, and they can't see across to other cells either. And they couldn't even see the guards, because it's built in a way where the guard could stand in a central point and see from all directions. It saved on money, you wouldn't need that many guards to patrol, and also it meant that, they could keep watch on of the different cells without actually going down the different aisles. And so it's very, very, very solitary, and of course psychologically that's a huge stress on a lot of people. So sometimes you could argue it might have been even worse than the physical sort of forms of punishment. So to talk about maybe some of the characters or some of the people that inhabited Port Arthur, you had a man, William Thompson. He was transported there for burglary, and he worked in the coal mine for a time. He witnessed 2 deaths, accidental deaths in the coal mine, obviously very harsh conditions. Then he went on to be a shoemaker, and he witnessed, I think, a sort of deranged prisoner attack the overseer and kill him. So, you can imagine these times, it was quite an unsafe place, not just for the prisoners, but also the guards. There's another story, I think his name is, Robert Young, and he was a guard in 1841. And what he did was, he was waiting for, he came in on the boat, it was dark, he stepped off onto the pier, and he fell into Mason's Cove and lost his footing, and he drowned from that. Even though people jumped in straight after to save him, but I think the water's so cold, you sort of lose your breath straight away, and the water drags you down, and I think, so he died from that incident there. There was also a man, William Riley. He was there for burglary and theft during the building of the church, which you see here. It's been gutted out by a fire. In the late 1800s there was a fire. But he, while working in the church, he attacked a man with the pickaxe he was working on with, and subsequently killed that guy. There's another incident when they're repairing the lead on the roof, and 2 people had an argument. Someone fell, I don't know whether he was pushed, and he fell to his death. So obviously they didn't have OH&S or safe work practices back then, so it was a very, very tough environment. And supposedly where that man fell and where the sort of blood hit the wall, no ivy grows in that area, so make of that what you will. So very, very horrible and brutal past, I guess, in a lot of ways. There's they say around 600 people buried in what they call the Island of the Dead. So it's basically a small parcel of land in the lake that's just off Port Arthur there, where they buried the dead. And a lot of prisoners would actually, take their own lives, or they would murder someone in order to be hanged to end their suffering. So, you can imagine how desperate you'd have to be to really do something like that. So it closed in 1877, and there was some really key sites that I want to talk about. So the church is one of the sites where some things go on, some hauntings. So there's Port Arthur as a whole, you see, back in 1860. There's the silent prison that I was talking about, and it's sort of like a cross shape where they can see from all directions the guard. That's the parsonage. That's where the Reverend George Eastman was around in the sort of mid-1800s. So George Eastman was a very like fire and brimstone character. He was quite feared. And in the 1870s, he died in the bedroom upstairs. And as they were removing his body, it goes that what happened, the scaffold gave way and his body sort of tumbled to the ground. And after that, there was sort of lots of different phenomena like moaning and lights and smelling of like rotting flesh in that sort of area. So it was quite an active site and still is apparently to this day, according to the witness reports. And so I want to go back to maybe the first reports that happened, and we're going to look at a paper called The Clipper. You can get this online. There's archives online that you can find this. So 1893, and the article I want to look at is by Regal, or his actual name is George Grunsell, and he explores some of the events about 20 years ago. Now you can't see that there. I'll try to highlight it, but I've got this book here which has the accounts. It's out of print, unfortunately, now. But I'm sure you can get it secondhand in some places. So what I'll do is I'll just read out a couple of these reports in this article here. And so the couple who owned this parsonage after the Reverend Eastman had passed away was the Haywards, Mr. and Mrs. Hayward. And they had this judge come stay with them. And he was a very matter-of-fact kind of person. They reported lights in this room, appearing in this room, and when they opened the door, nothing was there. And this judge didn't believe it, you know. Understandably, he felt it was just a load of nonsense, basically. Then one occasion, when the judge was here, staying in this place, the lights appeared in this room. You could see it sort of under the door. And what happened was, they peered through the keyhole, but couldn't see any light. Then they opened the door, then there was no light. But they could see the light coming from under the door and out the windows when they closed the door. So during the day, they investigated him, this judge, the doctor. They all went inside and investigated, but there was no explanation for it. And I think he was converted after that kind of experience, and you imagine you would be. Another occasion here, I don't think you can read it still, but I'll translate from here. One of the more, I guess, scarier occasions was Mr. and Mrs. Hayward were around in the house. Then they heard a shriek from one of their servants who was tending the fire. So they run to find out what was going on, and they see her sort of laying senseless on the floor. And so they try and bring her around. Eventually they, I think, box about her ears to rouse her, and she comes back to consciousness. And she reports seeing out of the window someone in a strange garb holding a knife as if ready to strike. And then as soon as she saw that, she you know, I think she passed out and would never go back to that room again, and that was it. But there's a lot of accounts like this, random knockings and things like that, poltergeist kind of activity going on in the parsonage, and that still, with current reports, happens to this day. So here's just a snapshot of the website, the ghost tours that they offer. I think they've been doing it from sort of 1988, around that time and onwards. And we've sort of got reports from those times going to, you know, up until the 2000s. So what I'm going to go on to now and talk about is some of the way we've analysed this data. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is a paper myself and Vlad published. So Vlad headed up this paper here on these reports and correlating them with geomagnetic activity and also the lunar activity too. So as you might know, there's theories out there that geomagnetic activity actually affects the amount of paranormal experiences that are experienced in a particular sort of area. And also there's some talk out there about how the moon phases might affect paranormal activity too. So we sort of investigate these things. I won't go into too much detail because I know there's been a talk on that already, but just to say we did find a correlation between moon activity and the paranormal witnessed experiences. despite what other literature says. We also found relationship between geomagnetic activity and his experiences. Although, unlike previous papers, we found that it happened at sort of quiet times when the geomagnetic activity was quite low, whereas other papers have found when it's actually quite high. And so we speculate that it might be not just a matter of GMA activity, but also things like wavelength and the modulation of the waves and all these other things that might combine in order to make these sort of experiences happen. So before we go on to our sort of next part, or talk about how we could analyze the data in other ways, I want to do something interactive, a bit of a memory game. And so what I have here, I've got a word list. So does everyone have something, whether you can write down on a paper or your phone even, something like that? I'm going to read out a word list, and I don't want you to write anything down as I'm reading them out, but after I've finished, I want you to then try and remember as many words as you can from that list that I've read. So don't write anything down as I'm reading it out, just afterwards. So I'll start with word list 1 if we're all ready. Sour, candy, sugar, bitter, good, taste, tooth, nice, honey, soda, chocolate, heart, cake, tart, pie. So take a minute now just to write down as many as you can remember. Okay, I'm going to go into my second word list now. So finish up with that, and we're going to do exactly the same thing, but with a different set of words. Steal, robber, crook, burglar, money, cop, bad, rob, jail, gun, villain, crime, bank, bandit, criminal. So if you want to spend another minute, just... All right, so finish up with that. So we only did the first 2 word lists. Just a hands up who got one of these words for either. Okay. Well, interestingly enough, those words weren't on the actual list. But it's not surprising that you got them. So here were the lists, just to show that. What actually happened in these cases, and it's not uncommon, is something called spreading activation. So if we imagine this as a network of neurons in your brain, I said a lot of words related to sweet in that list. There were a lot of words related to that. And so when I say sort of soda, cake, sugar, and lollies, then it also lights up other neurons in your brain, such as the word sweet, because there's associations there, there's semantic networks. And what that can do is so that can make you remember things or remember words that weren't on that list in that case. So hopefully it's quite interesting. I find these things quite interesting, And so why did I do that? Why did I show you that? To prove that you can never trust a psychologist, firstly. No. But no, what I want to show is that sometimes it prepares us and to prime us for our next part, but sometimes the mind can be inaccurate with things, sometimes. And what I want to talk about and explain in the next part is one way we can analyze these reports is to look at them in terms of how we can apply a sort of scientific or psychological lens to these reports. Now, it's important to remember when I say this, I'm not discrediting these reports. I'm not saying they're fake, by no means whatsoever. What I am saying, though, is I'm offering one potential explanation for them, scientific and then psychological one for them. I mean, I've done 8 years of training in psychology, and I have to use it for something. So I thought, let's try and apply it here and see if there's some psychological explanations here that's going on. Because if you ask me personally, I do believe in actually there's actually hauntings going on here and actually paranormal phenomena. But one way you can look at these reports is from a psychological lens. And so, like I say, I'm not discrediting any of these reports here, but I just thought it'd be good to explore this from that psychological perspective and take a look at this, because whilst I believe science can't explain everything around this, I also don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say science is completely useless also, because I think there's maybe a middle ground here where critical thinking and science can play a role, but at the same time remaining open-minded and also open to other possibilities. So what I think we'd do together is just look at some present-day reports, just to see, so you can see the witness reports there, and also see one type of explanation for those reports too. In Port Arthur, there's a place called the Dissection Room, where the chief surgeon, he allegedly autopsied bodies. And here's a couple of reports here. I'll read out the top one. My husband turned to me and said, "Can you smell metho?" I'd noticed it very strongly when I entered the room. I assume they use it to clean the room. And we were both amazed when the guide mentioned also how musty it was. And they both said, yes, it smells like metho. Now, very possibly it could have smelled like methylated spirits, certainly, and it could have been a paranormal phenomenon there. But there's another potential way of looking at it. One way is potentially suggestion. So this is Dave Ellman. He wrote a book, I think it might 60s or quite a while back, called Hypnotherapy, and he was quite big in that area. And he talks about an incident where he hypnotizes people while they're awake, or implants a suggestion while they're awake. And what he does is he gets a fresh egg, he cracks the egg open and goes, "God, doesn't that smell? Isn't that rotten?" To everyone. And then he gets them to pass it round, and then the other people go, "Yeah, oh, that smells rotten." Maybe they're lying maybe they don't think it smells, but they're thinking, well, I better say because he's up in front of the audience and he's in charge. Or maybe they're doing it because they actually do smell something, rotten. And what he's saying is, well, through that suggestion, I've implanted that into their mind, a waking hypnosis suggestion, if you like, and they smell that. And that could be a potential explanation in some cases. If you think the name Dissection Room, what comes to mind is things like formaldehyde, blood, these sorts of smells, and that could be a possible, you're sort of primed to sort of smell things like that. If we go back to the Dissection Room, some other cases as well, the patterns we saw were sort of like faces, or it looked like a face inside, saw a face through the air vent. If we look at the Dissection Room more closely, that's a bit how it looks. So there's like patchy areas, it's quite irregular brickwork, very pock-marked. It's not the best picture, but you can sort of see in the background sort of dark and light areas. And that sort of, like I said, these faces, people could have seen faces, and they certainly could have, but there could also be pareidolia at play, which is seeing faces where no faces exist. So this rock formation here, it looks like a face. But it's really just a natural rock formation and then our knowledge or our way of seeing things sees a face there where there is none. It's sort of like when you look at things in the clouds and you see images, but they're not there. The last one I'll just explore in this tangent is from various around the site. Heard a tiny vibrating sound, a bit like a faraway bell. Too tiny for a bell, and it stopped, then it started again. And someone else heard a bell sound. Then in another report, we hear someone told them, "Oh, it's probably the clock. I heard the clock going off in the asylum." And so from other people's reports, you can maybe get an idea, oh, okay, maybe that's something at play, or an environmental variable that could be causing some of these sounds. And some people also mention vibrations as well. And you think, well, are these things related? Possibly, I don't know. But it's just another way of looking at things. And it's a bit like an investigator. You're trying to piece together a puzzle. But there's also a lot of reports that are very, very hard to apply a psychological lens to. I'm sure there can be some theories out there and things, but a lot of reports that are hard to explain unless you come from other perspective and a parapsychological perspective, and a sort of one that looks at sort of life after death and haunts being real phenomena in that sense. And these are sort of groups of people the three of us walking down the street at the back, and we all heard footsteps behind us. We turned around and we saw a bottom half of someone chasing after us. You know, these are quite compelling accounts, multiple witnesses seeing the same thing. It's a shame we can't follow up and ask more questions, because I'd love to, but it's sort of quite compelling accounts. And so, like I say, it's interesting to apply theories to these things, but there's some really compelling accounts here where theories are hard to fit. But I wasn't interested in necessarily analysing the data like that. I think things like that have been done in the past quite a lot. And also, I could apply theories to that. It might be quite interesting to do so, but at the end of the day, you're not going to really get to the bottom of anything. You're not going to be able to prove anything, disprove anything, prove they're real, prove they're not, because it's just one potential explanation. One way we can look at the data is looking at how people react to these phenomena and see any patterns and things like that. So that's something I'm interested in looking at. So what do people do? Well, a lot of people, after they've experienced something, they engage in a little deductive reasoning process. So they go, well, I ruled this out. It could be an event here, but no, I don't think it was. It could have been this, but I've asked that person and then they weren't standing anywhere near me. So they try and rule things out like a hypothesis test. And these are things I'm interested in looking at, how people react and what that can tell us about, you know, how these things are reported. But what I'm working on now is what we call a qualitative analysis, many of you might be aware, or a thematic analysis of the data. And this is what I want to get your help in right now to see how you might conduct an analysis on this data. And I've got some reports here, and I'm going to hand them around soon. And I'd like you to look at these, and we're going to conduct a sort of basic thematic analysis on the data here, and I'll explain what I mean just now. So thematic analysis is essentially just finding patterns or themes within the data. So things coming up maybe often, as you see it in the data there. So what that entails, and you've got a nice reference here that you can refer to. I recommend having a look at that if you're interested. But you get familiar with it. You generate things called codes. So basically, there are things coming up that seem to come up often. So interesting features of the data that you want to label. And then eventually those codes build up and they build into themes. So patterns, you see patterns throughout the data, and then they become a theme, and then you review those themes, you double check. And I'll show you what an example like this looks like. So I made this example up. It's about someone moving out of the house. And pretend this is like an interview transcript. So looking at this transcript, moving out of home has been both good and bad experience. I've had to organise things for myself, like if I don't do it, it won't get done. So I've highlighted that, and I could code that as becoming independent. So that sentence there, or that phrase, suggests that moving out of home, a part of that is getting your own independence. It can get pretty lonely sometimes living by yourself. There's no one to talk to, and the silence also takes some time to get used to. Well, I've highlighted that, and I've labelled that as feeling lonely. So that's the code I've applied to it. Then my relationship with my parents has improved. They're always there if I need. I've highlighted that as relationship with parents. And again, I get to make my own decisions, becoming independent. And then over time, you might see these same sort of codes coming up in your data, and they become themes. So, for example, feeling lonely might become a theme, overall theme of isolation. Becoming independent might become an overall theme of independence, and same with relationship with your parents. So this is basically how a thematic analysis is conducted. Obviously, it takes a lot more time, but what I would like us to do, and maybe within the next sort of 5 minutes or so, is if I just hand these around in groups or just by yourself, I'd like to just have a look at these reports, and I'd like to get your take on what codes you find here and what themes you find here. And I want you to look specifically for themes relating to the sensory experience. So what sort of sensory things are coming up here? Can you, from looking at this report here, what kind of sensory things? So one thing I see is I felt it was a little girl. I felt a hand on the side of my face. So that suggests touch here, tactile experience. Is there anything else that you would, or anyone wants to? Love. Yeah. Yeah, so an emotion, it could become a theme of emotion that we see throughout, yeah. Yeah, there's a visual component, yeah, absolutely. Sorry? Positive, yeah, yeah. And so that might be a theme, you know, positive versus negative versus neutral, you know, that you come up with the data. The temperature. Yep, exactly. So cold, hot, depending on what comes out the data. And also, look, I experienced the presence. Might that be like a sensory, you know, like something beyond the five senses, potentially? Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It could be, you might find that patterns in the data like that, and it could be surprising what you find. So look, what I'm going to do, and it sounds like you've got sort of the gist of it, hand these round, have a look, and just want to see what codes and themes you come up with, because everyone's going to come up with different things based on their own backgrounds and experiences. So maybe we can spend the next 5 or 10 minutes doing that. That works all right. So if I can give you, and just pass them back, please. So you just finish up. I know it's quite a big task to do in 5 to 10 minutes, so whatever you got done, well done, because it's not an easy process, especially if it's your first time doing something like this. But if you wouldn't mind sharing, I'd love when we finish the talk, if you can pop your sheets up here, so I'd love to see what you had to say. And like I said, this is a work on progress, and it'd be great to get your input on this. So I'll just show you some of the things we found already that were categorized in terms of the sensory experiences. So these are some of the ones here, and I'll go through them sort of one by one, hopefully talking about them in a bit more detail. And maybe you'll find you've found the same themes, even in that short, in that little, just a little page of 15 or so reports. You might have found a similar sort of things as we did. So one of the themes was sort of the sensory experience happening in the atmosphere or in the environment. So that's where the sort of atmosphere was thought to be impacted by some sort of paranormal phenomena. So we've got sort of reports here talking about cold spots. You know, that's quite common, obviously, in sort of hauntings, cold spots and things like that. But others will talk about the air being quite thick, or the atmosphere sort of being odd in some ways. And we found this thing coming up, sort of the atmosphere and the environment changing in some way, in some local spots a lot of the times, due to apparent sort of paranormal sort of phenomena. Then there's these sort of asensory kind of experiences. So those reports that seem to go beyond the five senses. So intuition was very common. So feeling the presence of something. I think a lot of people picked up on presences, even if they didn't report themselves to be of the psychic, have psychic skills, if you like. But also sort of clairvoyant and clairaudient. A lot of experiences as well, people would say, look, I feel that there's these people here, or I feel, I could feel they were hanging off the rafters. So you wouldn't normally say, I saw people hanging off the rafters. So a lot of like feeling or thinking would signify that it might be a sort of asensory experience rather than, you know, using terms like seeing or hearing, which were common with sort of visual or auditory sort of experiences there. And usually these experiences were quite more detailed compared to other experiences. So they might include names and details of the person. Obviously, if they're picking up on the history of a haunt of a person who is deceased and is haunting a location, they usually had more detail than some of the other reports. There's auditory experiences, which is pretty self-explanatory. A lot of footsteps and laughing and human kind of reports. But there's also nondescript sounds, knocks and bangs, animals and non-human sounds, and such as growls. And then obviously you had the human sounds as well. There's also some mechanical kind of sounds like keys turning and things like that would happen with these reports too. But that's quite straightforward in terms of that theme. I think you'll find that comes up a lot. We have emotional experiences, and so this could be separated in a couple of ways. One in terms of positive and negative emotions, mostly negative in this instance, but there were some positive things. But also you could divide it in terms of what you might call, and there's plenty of ways of saying this, but sort of like an emotional insertion. So where the emotions don't seem to come from within you, but seem to have been forced on you by sort of an outside entity, and so you feel a certain way, not because you're feeling that way, but because something is making you feel that way. So some of these emotions you might find that were sort of unnatural to the person was feelings of sort of sadness or even love sometimes. And you wouldn't typically, I mean, if you saw an apparition, you might expect maybe fear or shock, particularly if it's the first time seeing something like that. So sadness and love might not generally fit into that context, and so we'd usually see those emotions coming up, usually when an outside entity sort of made someone feel that way for whatever reasons. Usually as well, when a person felt some way because of an outside entity, words such as overwhelmed and intense were using, so those emotions were usually quite intense when it was from something else. And you could usually tell when an emotion didn't come from the person because they would say, you know, when I was in this location, I was feeling sad. As soon as I exited, I was fine. You know, it's sudden change that you wouldn't expect. Or they might go, why am I feeling so sad right now? There's no reason. Or they would even talk about like a cold spirit sort of enveloping their body and then feeling in a certain way. So these sort of emotional experiences, when they come from the outside, these sort of markers indicated that it was more than just the person's emotions. There was something else involved. So we talked a bit about this, tactile experiences, so having felt something make contact, touched, poked, pushed and things like that, stabbed in some cases and strangled. Typically things like being pushed or hit would be a negative experience, but not always. You know, sometimes they were like a gentle push, or something would hit their head and it might feel strange, but it wasn't necessarily like a hard hit, like a punch or something like that. And so they usually, in terms of what defined it as being a malign experience or a neutral/positive one, was, I guess, the intensity of it, but also how the person interpreted it, and also the position where the touch was felt. Someone felt just a touch on their shoulders, but it was like two cold hands on their shoulders. And that made them scared and feel quite freaked out. And that's understandable. I mean, next time you meet someone for the first time, try walking up behind them, putting your hands on their shoulders. And even though it's a light touch, it will probably freak them out. Don't try that. But it is, it's quite an intimate thing. And so people, you know, so it's not necessarily the intense experiences. Sometimes it can be a touch in the wrong place that makes it a negative experience. Another category here, just to say, was also breath. So being breathed on, classified under tactile. I mean, you could argue one way or the other. But if someone interpreted it as being breathed on, that's sort of an attempt to sort of touch someone or something's touching them in some way. There was another category that we found was sort of bodily experiences. And it kind of overlaps with tactile in a sense. But these are things that sort of seem to originate in the body, and not sort of from the outside of being touched from the outside, but seem to come from the inside. So I've got an example here, and I'll read it out. I felt like I was being stabbed and very cold. 7 stabs pounding on my chest. I felt as though I was bleeding heavily with a lot of pain. So that's a very horrible experience, and a very tactile kind of experience. Something is feeling stabbing. That's quite horrible and physical and tactile. But then they go on to say, I had a sharp pain in my chest. It made my breathing difficult, and it lasted about 30 seconds. And this would be maybe more of a bodily experience because it comes from within, this tight chest or finding breathing difficult, feeling nauseous, for example. These are all sort of bodily things. And so that's what we might classify, or these are the things we found come out that might fit within more bodily than tactile here. We had things like malfunctioning devices. So typically you're in a place, a ghost tour where people have cameras and things like that. So usually we found cameras and video cameras, watches sometimes, a kerosene lamp malfunctioning, a radio. So different devices, mostly cameras and things, and they're not working. And usually they wouldn't work in a specific location, and then moving from that specific location, they'd start working again inexplicably. So we found this sort of category. Mechanical experiences, so these were sort of moving objects. Being the last person to exit from the front right hand from the door, it closed behind me, so closing doors was typical, but also moving floors. and things of that nature. We had a toilet roll, I think, as well. Toilet roll, just inexplicably move across from in a toilet stall as well. A mental experience, so we didn't get many of these, so these are sort of like possession type experiences or trance-like experiences from an outside sort of entity. We got a couple, but not too many in this instance. Visual experiences, pretty self-explanatory. And we got, these were probably the most common experiences we found. So we separate these into sort of animals and non-human forms, and also nondescript images. So you had lots of lights, mists, shadows, and you could sort of further differentiate into like more detailed apparitions and less detailed. Some were just figures, some were just partial, and it wasn't necessarily that the apparition was a partial apparition, but it might be just they were blocked partially from view as well. So that could play into, or they were in the distance, so the person couldn't see the thing clearly. So that's why, you could sort of categorize them in those ways as well. And we found some other themes here, such as olfactory, smell, taste, and physical evidence, photos, scratches. Someone found that half their full bottle of drink was empty by the end of the evening and no one had touched it. So these sorts of things contribute sort of to physical evidence as we saw it. So these were just a catalogue of some of the things we experienced and that would come out in the data. You might have experienced a similar thing in the witness reports you have. And I'd love to see your experiences if you'd like to share them with me by putting your paper on the thing once we're finished. And I think that's pretty much it. Yeah.